Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you're very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. And if you are new here, might I suggest that you check out one of my other videos before you come back to this one, because today we're celebrating the fact that this channel now has more than 20,000 subscribers, and we're doing that with an AMA/Q&A session. I asked you for questions and oh boy, you delivered, in numbers that I certainly wasn't expecting. And so my wonderful, patient and frankly long-suffering husband Jamie has compiled those questions into a list, and he's going to be asking them for me now, and he's sat right there next to the camera. I haven't read these questions, so it's going to be a surprise to me. You're going to be seeing my first reaction and responses to them. I do hope you're going to enjoy this. I'm really looking forward to it. And once again, thank you so much. Let's jump in.
So we've grouped the questions together into a number of themes. First theme looks at how history can be analysed, so ultimately reading the past. Lisa asked, the Victorians read history through their lens of progress, and we read history through a lens of social justice. Do those lenses distort history? Do we lionise people who were unimportant in their time and demonise some people who were genuinely good people, born under legitimately horrible laws and customs? Is history a cafeteria for us to choose our heroes and villains? If not, is there such a thing as a sterile approach to history in which our views don't affect research?
I think ultimately the study of history is always going to be political in some way, shape or form. It's going to be taught by people who have personal politics. It's going to be weaponised by governments and curriculum. And I think also your own personal experiences, your own personal politics is naturally always going to affect the way you interact with, explore and understand the world around you and the world that's come before. What's important, I think, is that we always acknowledge that we are doing that. Is it possible to make a completely sterile history? Yes, I think it probably is. I think it's possible to create something that knows no politics, no national identity, no gender or sex identity. That is possible. Although I do wonder what it would teach us and how much it would speak to us. We as teachers and as learners have to understand that what we're getting is perspective. We're getting a person's perspective on a series of events that may be separated from them by many, many centuries and is potentially as affected by what happened last week as by the event itself.
Sophie wanted to know, how would women have interpreted their own actions, education, etc., without the modern feminist lens?
Well, I mean, that's a fascinating thought experiment, and I wonder that myself. If we were attempting to experience or understand the lived history of women, if we were perhaps looking at suffragists and suffragettes campaigning for the vote and emancipation, shall we say, and those things hadn't been achieved, if women didn't have the vote, if they hadn't been emancipated, how would we as women look back on the Pankhursts et al? Well, they'd potentially be terrorists, wouldn't they? Rather than freedom fighters. They'd be the people that lost, who failed to know their place. So we have to respect that when we are looking at events in history, it is written by the winners. And so those events, those histories, could absolutely change.
Lara asked, what advice or suggestions would you give to people who like learning about history, but sometimes feel overwhelmed by the amount of information available? What do you think is the best approach to learning about an event or a person in history?
Well, nobody's going to expect you to be Google. And so I would recommend that you stay with what interests you and fascinates you. If parts start taking you down a path where you're starting to lose interest, I would suggest you go back around and go back to the thing you care about. And if that takes you down a different rabbit hole, that's wonderful and amazing. And you might find the thing that you were less interested in suddenly becomes vital and important, and so you need to understand it to help boost your interest. I don't think you have to keep rigorously focused on knowing everything about a particular year or decade or century or rule, because that doesn't mean that you're a better historian. If you focus on the minutiae, the thing that really grips you, and you make that into your passion, then that is what's right for you.
Wilm asked a very interesting question. Can you point out some of the repeating patterns that you have seen from the time of the medieval period, early modern period, into today?
Yes. It may not be a particularly popular one, but it might also be one that we can all feel an affinity to in the current circumstance. And something that I've seen as a recurring pattern is that when there are profound moments of social and political change for, in quotes, the greater good, they tend to be preceded by a moment of incredible pain and suffering. So what seems to alter the way that society functions is something that is seismic. So war and plague, sometimes one following the other.
Now, some more personal questions. Claire and Gemma asked, just tell us some little things about yourself. Where you grew up, do you have brothers or sisters? Were your parents teachers? Whereabouts in England are you from?
Right, I'm a North Londoner, born and bred. I am an only child and my parents weren't teachers. My father is an accountant and my mother, for most of my childhood, was, as far as I'm aware, the only woman who was doing her job in the country, because she was an MOT examiner. And I'm not sure if you have those in America, but essentially it's somebody who is a mechanic for cars, who tests them to make sure they're roadworthy. So she was a service manager making sure that cars worked. So she's very mechanically minded.
Cindy wanted to know, have you done any work to see if and how you are related to any of the people you tell us about?
Well, Jamie and I did go down the route of spitting in the tube for 23andMe. Other providers are available, and this is hashtag not sponsored. And I was absolutely heartbroken to find out that I'm not secretly related to a member of the royal family. Apparently, I share a common ancestor from about 10,000 years ago with Louis XV, I believe, maybe the 16th. It was so distant that I didn't really pay attention to which king it was. I'm utterly heartbroken by that. But your DNA was far more fascinating in terms of its demographics. Mine was super boring.
Basma asked, what time period are you specialised in?
I am a specialist in the early modern period. So that's a quite baggy term. Most people would date it from around about the 1400s or a period known as the late medieval period. Some people go all the way up to the Enlightenment. My particular period is Tudor through to Stuart.
A whole range of people, including Gamey Girl, Pam, Olivia, Mina, Regina, Raquel, Bumblebee, Joshua and Tampa Cubana asked, what is your background and when did your passion for history begin? Was there one event that started all this?
Probably not one event, but I think a massive factor in influencing my love of history was my maternal grandfather, who took a massive hand in raising me. My mum went back to work when I was quite small, so I was being cared for by my grandfather until I started school. And he was incredibly passionate about history, and so he would take tiny baby me to the Tower of London, and I very, very clearly remember being taken to St Paul's Cathedral and walking up the stairs to the Whispering Gallery. As a small caveat, I will say that he probably did share things with me that were not appropriate for a 3-year-old. For example, the particular ways in which Henry VIII dispatched some of his wives using a sword and an axe. That probably wasn't something that I should have known, but I surely did.
Raquel, Zaira, Nicole and Vintage Michelle asked, is there any advice for someone who may be on the fence on becoming a historian such as yourself? Are there master's or PhD studies that you recommend, or do you have any advice about those? And could you give a rundown of your own experiences with studying history at a higher level of education? If an individual is interested in history and is thinking of pursuing a degree, what would be the best method to study a particular time period independently?
Well, I think a lot of, when it comes to choosing the degree, a massive factor is going to be the department. If you already have a knowledge on what you want to focus on and you're looking to go to BA, then my recommendation would be to go for something with the greatest breadth, but to potentially pick an institution where you already know that there is going to be a focus on the particular area that you're interested in. If you don't know yet which period of history you want to focus on, then I would go by how many modules you can see that appeal to you. So have a little look at what they're offering, see what the tutors are doing, have a look at the books they've published, and see if you think it might be a good fit for you. As you move through with Masters and PhD, if you find that passion, that subject, then really the key thing is finding the right institution with the right teachers who are going to be supportive, who are going to be there for you in office hours, who are going to be willing to answer emails and sit down and unpack things. And a lot of it is down to the department, but also your fellow students. So that's where the magic happens, if you will. It's being in the classroom with people who inspire you and who challenge you. And unfortunately, you aren't really going to know that until you rock up on the first day.
Again, lots of people asked, can you talk a bit about your academic career thus far? Things such as which university you went to as an undergraduate, where you completed your doctorate, and what you wrote your thesis on. How did you get your doctorate? Could you explain the education system in the UK?
Well, I'm probably a pretty rare example because I went the whole way through from BA to doctorate at the same institution. I stayed at the University of Sussex all the way through, so I lived in Brighton for a decade. My thesis ended up being, the full title is Things Necessary and Unnecessary, Trash and Trifles in Early Modern England. So with that being said, I suppose I'm a doctor of trash, but I don't like to necessarily announce that in a room. And what it is to get a doctorate in the UK, and I assume the academy across the world is pretty similar. The point of writing a doctorate, certainly in a humanities subject, is that you are able to prove that what you've done is a genuine original contribution to knowledge. So you can't just rehash or regurgitate somebody else's work, you have to put a new spin on it. Of course, when you're looking at things like Shakespeare and the early modern world, the court of the Tudors and the Elizabethans, a lot of material has already been written. So it tends to be that you focus on something really, really niche, hence trash and trifles. And then once you've written your thesis, which is around about 80,000 words, you then have to go in and have a viva, which comes from the Latin viva voce, in the living voice. So you are defending your thesis, your argument, to two examiners. It's certainly in the UK. One is your internal examiner who works for your institution and makes sure that all of the various things that your university wants are being adhered to. And the other is your external examiner, who tends to be a closer expert in the field of what you've written on. And they ensure that your thesis meets those criteria, that the argument is well thought out and that it's an original contribution to knowledge. And then after that, there may or may not be a pass. And if there is a pass, it may or may not be with corrections, some major, some minor. If you pass with or without corrections, you then complete those corrections if there are them. You then bind your thesis, as mine is bound here, and then it goes to your university, you graduate, you're a doctor. That's how it works.
Thomas asked if you have any specific memory of fighting to defend your love of history with a teacher, a friend or family member.
I don't think so. I suppose I've been pretty lucky in that way, or maybe just bloody minded. I mean, I've certainly been called a geek and a pedant, and people know that a great way to wind me up is to bring up a well-worn historical inaccuracy, usually one that's been put around by a fictional programme or film, and they know that that's going to get my eye twitching and me potentially losing my temper. So I've definitely been goaded by people, but they tend to accept me for all of my strange quirks. I've never really felt the need to defend my love of history.
Elizabeth's question was, during your studies, were there any areas that you initially thought were boring or dry, and then later changed your mind about? Vice versa, any periods or sources that you thought you'd enjoy learning more about, but actually found quite dull? As your studies became more specialised, was there a period of history that you were sad to let go of? Also, what is your dream primary source that you'd love to get your hands on?
Oh, boy, oh boy. Right, there's a lot there. That's very, very dense. I think when I was first at university, I was surprised that I didn't find myself being more interested by a course on the novel and that sort of period of history going into Victorian literature. It just didn't grab me in quite the same way that early modern drama did. And I'd always enjoyed Shakespeare, but it was at university that I became utterly, unspeakably obsessed. And by the second year of my BA, I was already picking modules that were focused on that period, which I don't think I'd necessarily thought was going to happen. And I don't think I've ever given up looking at a particular period of history. I think that there's always time and space to dive in. I do wish that I felt as at home in some other historical periods, and particularly the Georgian period. Like, I feel like I've got snapshots of it, and I'd love to feel the same way and the same level of comfort with the Georgians as I do with the Tudors and Stuarts. What source would I love to get my hands on? I think this will probably not come as a surprise to many people who are interested in the period of history that I'm interested in. I would love to be able to go into the Vatican, into their library, and have a look at Henry's letters to Anne Boleyn. Even better, as a side sweetener dish to that, would be if alongside those, some miraculous way, we had her lost responses. That would be delicious to have those two things. But I think I've got probably more chance of finding the lost letters than of getting into the Vatican. But you never know, things can change.
Dima and Emily asked, what do you do for a living? Are you a professor at a college or do you work for a private organisation?
Well, currently, I do this for a living because the world's on shutdown. And when I'm not doing this, I'm a freelance academic. So I lecture and I tutor, and I also work as a historical interpreter. And I mostly do those things within heritage locations, some of which are more closely tied to university institutions. But in this country, the term professor, it's not something that happens because you teach in a university. You have to be elected or submitted to become a professor. So there's plenty of people in English universities who are lecturing full time, who are what the American equivalent of is tenure, I think, but they aren't professors because that's a different thing.
What is your dream course to teach?
Something that doesn't exist, but it would involve looking at swordplay and Shakespeare, and perhaps all of early modern drama, and it would be about occupying space, so how the wearing of swords affects the way that people interact with each other in the real world, but also on stage. That's very off the top of my head, but that's the course I'd love to teach.
Both Catherine and Melanie asked if you participate in historical events where you're dressed in Tudor attire. What would be your favourite period of dress to wear?
I have actually indeed been in historical costume and been involved in events because as part of my job as a live costumed historical interpreter, we wear the costume of various different periods, and I've actually worn costume that's gone from the medieval period around Edward I all the way through to the 20th century. So I have worn a fair swathe of different outfits. I think probably the one that I felt the best in and the most sort of majestic, and rightly so because she was indeed a queen, was playing Caroline of Ansbach, which you get to wear a full Georgian court mantua, and if I can find a picture of me in that, I might just insert it because that was brilliant.
So there was also a question about YouTube. Kay Careless wanted to know what made you decide to start a YouTube channel.
I think actually I wanted to be able to communicate my love and passion for history, but I also recognise in some ways my own limitations. I've made a video on the fact that I'm diagnosed with dyslexia, So I find communicating in a written form quite difficult. So I'm aware that I did write a PhD thesis, but that was a blood, sweat and tears event that required lots of assistance in terms of proofreading. I have the ideas, I know how to communicate them, but I'm far better verbally than I am in written form. So the YouTube channel felt like a fairly natural way to do it. A lot of other people in my position probably would have made an online blog and typed up their ideas because they're more comfortable in that way. But that just wasn't who I was. So that's why we're here now.
There are also a lot of questions about shelves and books. Carol asked about the objects on your shelf and how you acquired them.
Right. Well, I'm going to own up to being a low-key hoarder who does not like a flat surface. A lot of the objects that are behind me have come from my husband, because he did a lot of work abroad, and whenever he would go away, as a way to pacify me for his absence, he would bring me back gifts. And so a lot of these are gifts that he's given me from being away. Some of them are also things we got on our honeymoon, so reminds us of a really happy time. And yes, it's things and trinkets that are meaningful to me that I've acquired over the years from various sources, but a lot from my husband. Oh yes, of course. So I have actually had people mention what is the green thing, and there is also a matching red thing as well. These are little dinosaur puppets that we got for our wedding from a couple of our guests who did readings at the wedding, and we got to keep the puppets afterwards. So that's what that's from, and it's a very happy memory. It was The Lovely Dinosaur was the reading.
And it was amazing.
It was amazing. It was beautiful. There wasn't a dry eye in the house.
Eve wants to know where you found that lovely shelving system behind you.
IKEA. Hashtag not sponsored. Love it. Love a bit of IKEA. Flatpack is my... if I'm not listening to true crime, then the next thing I want to be doing is building Flatpack. It is where I find my zen. Some people do yoga. I want to do Flatpack.
Simon asked if you read them, what do you think of the Hilary Mantel novels? Wolfhall, Bring Up the Bodies, and The Mirror and the Light, based on the life of Thomas Cromwell.
I am currently working through Mirror and the Light. I've just got it, and I really like Hilary Mantel's telling. It is, of course, historical fiction, but it's really, really well researched historical fiction. For me, the first book, Wolfhall, I really enjoyed her narrative technique where you're not quite sure who's speaking. So you feel like you're listening at doorways. And that isn't what happens so much in Bring Up the Bodies. And I can understand why. It's quite an odd technique to use, but for me, I found it incredibly compelling. I suppose my only caveat is that in her rehabilitation of Thomas Cromwell, which is definitely what she's doing, I don't quite know why we have to demonise Thomas More as much as she does. That's my only caveat, but I think they're brilliantly written books and they are utterly fascinating.
Joyce asked, who is your favourite author?
I don't know if I've actually got a favourite author. I really enjoy the work of a lot of different people. I think I love the way Helen Castor writes history. I really enjoyed Neil MacGregor's work on Shakespeare the Rest of His World. I like Hilary Mantel for fiction. I enjoy true crime authors. I wouldn't say that I've necessarily got a favourite author though.
Jacqueline wants to know what teacher or book inspired your love of history.
Well, the teacher who inspired my love of history was my grandfather, for sure. And then going on from that, being at university and having various tutors who wanted to put the work of Shakespeare and his contemporaries in its historical moment, and having that freedom to be interdisciplinary and look at philosophy and material culture and art as a way to understand these plays, and being able to expand my learning in that way, that really, really inspired me. And in terms of books and authors, I'm going to say again, Neil MacGregor's Shakespeare's Restless World really showed me that this was a way to view history, to teach history, and to comprehend history, to look at the objects and the texts and the time. and I just think it's fascinating.
Victoria asked if you could run through what is on your bookshelf behind you.
That also may well be a separate video, but broadly speaking, there is a method to the madness. So what you can't see is that the bookshelf stretches further. So we've got historical fiction, theatre text, so both plays and also theory of performance. Then we've got novels here. This is my Shakespeare, history, early modern period sections. Then we've got some sports books, they're my husband's. Some Marquis de Sade, I got that during my A-levels. I always suggest to read that by one of my A-level teachers who said if we're going to talk about philosophy and ethics, you best go away and read the Marquis de Sade and then we can start. So 17-year-old me had her eyes opened, that's for sure. Then we've got my true crime, some French literature in French, that's my husband's because he was educated in France. And then we've got some books on feminism, anthropology. So there is a method to the general madness, but it probably would do better to be organised more than it is.
Anne wanted to know, are you writing a book or do you want to?
I have got a novel in my head that I have written bits of chapters for, but not enough to be a book. And I also have an idea for a more sort of popular history book that is in its very, very early stages. But yes, I do want to write a book and I have got them in me. They need to come out of me.
Catherine pointed out that you mentioned in the previous video that you are dyslexic. How would you encourage others with similar learning issues to continue with their education?
I think first and foremost, it's about realising that you can do it, but it has to happen on your terms. I've often said that when I look at my dyslexia diagnosis and what it's meant for me as a learner, what really has happened is that my brain just doesn't function as well within the confines and constraints of what's expected of the modern curriculum and education system. I often said that if I'd been born a boy, because I wouldn't have been educated in the same way otherwise, but born a boy 500 years ago and I've been at university and most of the defences would have been oral and there wouldn't have necessarily been the expectation to write, I would have been far better off. Also, when I did have to write, spelling wasn't standardised, so nobody would have cared. So that's the thing, is it's not that you're broken, it's just that the system, you're a jigsaw piece that doesn't completely fit. So you have to find a way to ask for the help and demand that the rest of the jigsaw pieces are cut so that you can fit in. And that's your right, because you're just as valuable and your contribution is just as valuable as anybody else's. And in many ways, because of the diversity of the way that you approach things, you're a valuable addition. And that is something that you need to hold on to.
We also have a question from one of my favourite named subscribers to your channel. Crazy Old Bat wanted to know, what are some of your favourite hobbies not having to do with history?
Watching TV, not historical in any order, and hanging out with our chinchillas.
Sherry asked simply, what's your favourite colour?
Purple.
Christine absolutely loves your pinkish eyeshadow palette. Could you let her know who makes it?
I think that what you're talking about is actually a bronzer. It's the Laura Mercier baked bronzer that I wear in my crease. And so it's not actually an eyeshadow, but I have repurposed it.
Justin, Crystal, Mary, Casey and Rory, amongst others, wanted to know how you and I met. There's even somebody who asked, am I a historian as well?
Well, you're not a historian. No. You're a scientist, so your degree was in anthropology. And how we met was between me finishing my BA and starting my MA, I was working in a pub as a barmaid, and full disclosure, I was one of the world's worst barmaids, could not get an order right to save my life. They mostly kept me around because I was prepared to stop fights, I think. And in walked Jamie with a friend of his, and it being Brighton, I thought to myself, well, if they aren't a couple, I'll have the little one. And I did. And 12 years later, here we are. We got married 3 years ago. So we met in the March, and by the August we were living together. So we lived in sin for a good 9 years, and then we got married, and it's all been great.
So we arrive at the section which is all about your personal preferences. Hilary and Jason were wondering, what do you think is the biggest myth that is still widely believed in British history?
That Anne Boleyn had a stick finger.
Emily asked if an independent TV channel, she did name a few, came to you with an unlimited budget and all the resources in the world, what historical period or event would you like them to make a series about? And what lens or viewpoint would you want it seen through?
Right. If I could, it would be a topic within a period. I would like to look at childbirth in early modern England and the potential differences of what happens for Reformation. So how women are dealing with the pains of childbirth in a Roman Catholic England versus a Church of England, and what that means. So I'd want to look at the medical history, the birth of mankind, what confinement's like, look at it on a class divide and also a religious divide. That would be excellent.
Now here's a tough one. Alex wanted your personal opinion. Which dynasty ruled England the best? Now it's a multiple choice question. The House of Normandy, House of Plantagenet and its cadet branches, House of Tudor, House of Stuart, House of Hanover, or the House of Saxe-Coburg-Windsor. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think in terms of success, it's Saxe-Coburg to Windsor, which broadly speaking follows on from the Georgians, because I think to successfully navigate the seismic political and social changes and the rise of mass media and a 24-hour news cycle, I think to successfully navigate that when you also aren't seen as a divine right monarch within a constitutional monarchy, to still have the sway they have, that to me is a really adaptable and successful monarchy.
Jennifer, Roxanne, Tara and Tampa Cubana asked, if you could have dinner with one historical figure, who would it be?
There is a Georgian female bare knuckle boxer called Elizabeth Wilkinson Stokes, potentially by her married name, and I would love to have dinner with her, possibly at a distance in case she tried to punch me, because she seems to have been really successful as a fighter.
And if you could ask them one question, what would you ask?
Why are you seemingly unbeatable? Because I can't find any record of her ever having lost.
And if they were a Tudor figure?
I would sit down with Catherine Parr and I would ask her how much she felt she had to compromise to keep her kingly husband happy, and whether she thinks marrying him was worth it.
What historical figure have you been fascinated by the most in your studies you would love to go back in time and meet?
One that we haven't already talked about? Maybe Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. I think she'd be a good laugh, and I think she also had seen and experienced things that to hear from a first person point of view would be really amazing.
Morgan asked, if you could swap places with any historical figure, who would you choose?
I think that living now is the best time to be alive. I wouldn't ever want to swap whole lives with a historical figure. It's simply too dangerous. But if I could see the world through the eyes of a historical figure, maybe somebody who sits on the periphery. So I made a video about Hans Holbein. I wonder if moving through the world as somebody like that, where you're in these court circles, but theoretically the risks are fairly low, that would be pretty fascinating. But I'd also want to be vaccinated and medicated up to the eyeballs to avoid the smallpox, the sweat, etc.
Quite a few people asked about your favourite time period to research. Do you have a favourite type of history, such as cultural, political, or intellectual history?
So my favourite time period is the early modern period. I think it's a kind of amazing crux point in shifting ideals and standards. And in terms of the way I like to explore that history, I'm very interested by material culture. I think that objects are aspirational, and I think that through aspiration and also objection, what we reject, we can find out a lot about the hopes, dreams and fears of people of the past, and that retains itself and is made evident to us in the materials they leave behind.
Another fascinating question. If you could uncover one historical thing that is currently unknown, which one would it be? I could probably guess.
Oh, I'd re-find Cardenio, Shakespeare's lost play, without a doubt. I'd make millions.
Tom and Tampa Cubana wanted to know, if you could look back and solve one historical mystery, what would it be?
Just one. Prince in the Tower, what happened?
The amazingly named Glitter Gollum and Shannon are both looking for some travel advice. What city, other than London, or perhaps which borough within London, in England do you think has the most interestingly rich history, in your opinion? What is the one historical place or thing you would recommend seeing in or around London if you had to choose? Where do you think is incredibly special or historic? Something perhaps even underappreciated that is incredibly important.
So, richest history borough-wise in London is what used to be known as the Liberty of the Clink, which is around Southwark. That has had a very storied history. Outside of London, I think you've got to go Bath or York for amazing history. I probably would pick Bath myself because the Roman connection, the Jane Austen connection. And in terms of outside of England, I think one of the most fascinating places is probably Budapest. They have got an incredibly rich history there.
Which is your favourite out of King Henry VIII's wives, and why?
Catherine Parr. I think she is a political animal. She doesn't always get it right. She perhaps gets it more wrong after Henry dies. But the fact that she's a published author, and also the influence that I believe she has on Queen Elizabeth.
Of all the Tudor queens, do you have a favourite?
Elizabeth I.
Hilary asked, who is the most underrated monarch and why?
I'm not sure that I can answer that. I could probably tell you who I think the most overrated monarch is, and that's Richard I. I think the so-called Lionheart, gets a lot of lionisation as being this quintessentially English person, but he hated it here and was rarely ruling.
Emma wanted to know who your favourite fictional queen is and why.
Bianca Del Rio, because not today, Satan.
Interesting question from Alan. Who would be your most colourful person in history who was least understood?
My instinct is to go with Bess of Hardwick, but fortunately, I think more and more we are seeing the various facets of her. But yeah, she's pretty exceptional and exciting.
Andrew wanted to know, who do you think is the most unjustly villainised monarch in history, in your opinion?
Maybe Mary I?
Question from Marie. If you go back in time and change one thing, one event, what would it be?
I mean, I've watched enough time travel movies to realise that if you mess with the timeline, you create problems. So I don't know if I actually, in truth, if the capacity was there, if I would go back, because you don't know what you're going to end up with. I mean, would I end up, being part mosquito because I'd messed with the timeline? I'm not up for that. But I think if I could actually change something, I would go back and suggest to Anne Boleyn that when he made her Marquis of Pembroke, she just stopped there, and then see what happens with history.
Melissa asked, who is your favourite lesser-known noble person?
It's hard for me to know who's lesser-known noble person, because I think I've made videos on the ones that are probably my favourites. So, for example, Arbella Stewart, but as again, Bess of Hardwick, who ends up being very noble. I think she's probably one of my favourites.
Here's a very unique question. Who is your favourite member of the KISS original lineup?
I don't know anything about KISS. My musical knowledge is musical theatre and 90s and noughties pop music, so it's Singing in the Rain and then Spice Girls. I know that KISS wear makeup and they have long tongues, and Gene Simmons is one of them. So let's go with him as being the one who's the winner. I don't know.
So on some questions about history, and if possible, can these be answered in 30 seconds or less? How did a small country like the UK conquer many parts of the world and its language become the most used?
Colonialism. That's how. The strength of the Navy and their willingness and capacity to colonise vast parts of the world for their own benefit.
Zoe asked, what is the biggest challenge for women today compared with the challenges faced by women 150 years ago? Do you think there's a particular trait women of the past held that women of today have lost?
I think the challenges of women before emancipation is that they were property. I think that now what women have to deal with is that misogyny is still alive and well, but it's no longer socially acceptable. So you have to try and see through the gauze of polite society. I think that one thing that we've actually lost, and we feel is a loss, is our capacity to be in charge of our medical well-being and that kind of autonomy. So the ownership of women of the physic garden, for example, but also the birthing room, that has been lost to us. Of course, the payoff is that it's been increasingly medicalised and therefore statistically safer, but it has been taken completely out of our hands, and we're just starting to regain that place once again.
Lady Liberty wanted to know, what is your opinion about the true identity of Shakespeare?
I believe, based upon the evidence that I've seen, that the man from Stratford, the son of the Glover, William Shakespeare, is the author or co-author of the plays attributed to him.
Christopher wanted you to explain the titling system, or rather, what does each mean, and are they hierarchical in nature?
So I'm taking that means the kind of the lordship title, Sir, Earls, Dukes. Yes, they are hierarchical in nature, and some have to be, for example, like a royal duke has to be the brother of a king, for example. They do have a strata, and to explain it more fully would require probably another video.
Onto a topic which we both enjoy, television. Judy and Emily wanted to know, what do you think about historical television shows like The Tudors, Reign and others? Do you find something enjoyable in them?
Yes, absolutely. I think that there's a kind of double-edged sword to it. So on the one hand, they are really entertaining and they definitely inspire an interest in the historical period, and that is incredibly valuable. I think there needs to be caution attached, and I would like it if it was clearer that while it may be based upon historical events, it is a fiction. And I think it's important that people go away and do their own research to figure out what actually happened and what was fictionalised to move the story forward.
Katie wanted to ask a fun question. Who would you cast as your dream historical TV show, assuming they'll do it well and accurately, of course?
First of all, let's think about what the TV show would be. I think I'd like to do one on bare-knuckle boxers in Georgian London, the men and women who are engaged in that really exciting sport. And I'm thinking about the people that I've seen in historical drama that I think have done an amazing job. And people like Anne-Marie Duff, Tom Hardy, James Frain, Mark Rylance, Natalie Dormer, all of whom, for me, have taken a historical character, historical figure, they've put their own spin on it, but they've also, in most cases, offered options, so they've not just gone down a singular role. I'm thinking particularly of Natalie Dormer's portrayal of Anne Boleyn. There are some historical inaccuracies in the Tudors, but one thing that I really enjoyed was her performance, because Anne wasn't vixen or victim, she was a whole person, and that's what I think is really fascinating. And if historical fiction is done well, we can deviate from the known truth in whatever form that is, and we can flesh out characters, but let's make sure they actually are fleshed out.
Onto a quick fire round about historical figures. Teresa asked, do you think King Henry VIII regretted dismantling the Catholic Church in England?
No.
Even at his death?
No, because I think he still thought he was Catholic.
Jan asked, do you think Elizabeth and Robert conspired to kill Amy?
Possibly, but I doubt it.
Linda asked, do you think Queen Elizabeth I was a man?
The Bisley Boy story. I don't have much truck with that one. I did make a video on it, on lots of myths about Elizabeth, and I'll leave it linked.
Christina wanted your opinion on Catherine de Medici.
She's not somebody that I know a lot about, because my specialty is English history, but incredibly compelling from what I do know.
So a question which I know you've discussed recently. Someone asking for more information about Catherine Parr and Thomas Seymour's daughter Mary, and how she sort of disappeared from history.
Well, that's one of the great mysteries. I think the consensus is that she's probably passed away around the age of about 2. Some suggest she may have grown up and got married. I'm not sure of that. I think she probably dies quite young.
A request to tell them a little bit more about Warwick the Kingmaker.
He played a good game. He was incredibly powerful, and I think ultimately he overplayed his hand. And he would be a great character to look at in a whole video. I don't think he's a quick-fire question kind of person.
With this week having been the anniversary of Anne Boleyn's death, what could you say about poor Mark Smeaton?
Poor musician Mark Smeaton, almost certainly tortured to extract a confession on the promise that he'd either be freed or he would suffer a less horrible fate and be beheaded rather than disemboweled as the commoner that he was. Almost certainly died having lied about having slept with Anne Boleyn, as far as I'm concerned.
There's a question about Queen Jane Grey and how she was written out of history because winners write history, but she was still a Tudor queen. So is there more we can learn about her from this distance?
I think there probably is, and I think it's very strange that she isn't known as Queen Jane to history. I think that she leaves behind a legacy of somebody who literally had greatness thrust upon them, didn't want it, didn't seek it, but when it was there, she did her best with it. And I think actually what happened was she was failed by those around her. I don't think there was any fault in her, and she probably would have made a fantastic queen of this nation.
Who was the most independent of the known female personalities of the Tudor period, please?
I'm going to probably have to go back to Bess of Hardwick. I think what she achieves and the wealth she accumulates is amazing levels of independence.
David asked, if the bowling cup really did belong to Anne and then passed down to her daughter Elizabeth first, why would she give it away to a doctor, even for the good treatment he bestowed on her? Surely Elizabeth would have kept the cup as it belonged to her mother.
I mean, that's an excellent point. Of course, it presupposes and assumes that that's all she had of her mother, and also that she would have wanted to have a keepsake of her. I think when we look at the Chequers ring, it's very nice to believe that the woman in there, alongside the portrait of Elizabeth, is Anne, but we don't know. If this was Anne's cup that came to Elizabeth and then she did pass it on in this way, perhaps that might give us an inclination or an idea of how Elizabeth felt about her mother, and perhaps it's not necessarily the romanticised version that we might like.
Hilary has always been fascinated by how often the answer to strife, issues, and perceived wrongdoings was beheading. Why not just lock them up in the Tower or somewhere else? Why was there so much beheading for so little of a crime?
Well, in the case of Lady Jane Grey and Guildford Dudley, I think Mary I's plan was to keep them imprisoned, but then more rebellion bubbled up, and it bubbled up with Lady Jane Grey as a figurehead. It's often been said that one of the reasons that Mary executes her cousin is because she wants to get married. She wants to marry Philip, and he isn't prepared to come to a country where her reign is in jeopardy. Mary is under threat in some ways because of Lady Jane Grey. She has tried to sit on the throne, and there are people that would try to raise her up. She's too dangerous to remain alive, and exiling her to a foreign nation where she could potentially get an army behind her is just never going to happen. Of course, beheading is a privilege, which might sound very peculiar, but you have to be nobility to be beheaded. So one of the reasons why we see so many beheadings during the period we're talking about is because there's such a lot of flux, and Henry, arguably following on from his father Henry VII, is cleaning house. There's a lot of people with true blood claims to the throne of England, and that's a problem.
Cassie asked, do you believe Elizabeth first gave birth?
I don't, no.
This is a fantastic question. If you had to teach my girls about any particular woman in history, who would you choose and why?
Just one. I mean, I've already mentioned her in this video. I think Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. This is a woman who is well-travelled. This is a woman who is a scientific innovator and a woman who lives by her own terms. I think she's not going to be perfect, because nobody is, but she's definitely a figure that young women should see as being aspirational, I think.
We also had a question around astrology. Do you have any knowledge of why, in the medieval and Renaissance time frame, astrology was heavily used in conjunction to Christianity? They all seem to take scripture so seriously and yet dabbled quite deeply within such activities.
Yes, that absolutely, and it doesn't necessarily make that much sense, except for people like, one of the most famous is Dr. John Dee, who is definitely mixing what we know now as classic science with things that are superstition or occult, according to us, and things that don't seem compatible with faith. But science is blurred in those terms. And also, he is treading a very, very fine line. His casting of horoscopes is quite dangerous. There is accusations that people are casting horoscopes to see when various monarchs are going to die so that somebody else might take over. And that, not only is that potentially heresy, it is also treason. To imagine the death of the king or the queen is almost as bad as actually planning it. I think the logic being that if you think about the possibility of the monarch dying, maybe you'll be inspired to hasten it along. So yes, it's incredibly dangerous even then, but there seems to be some wiggle room if it's deemed to be valuable to the person in power.
We also have a couple of questions about reading portraits. Elizabeth wondered if you would comment or read the portraits of young Elizabeth by William Scrots and the Aging Elizabeth painting of 1610.
Yes, I think absolutely reading them in conjunction with each other. They're all about, in both cases, it's about the presentation of somebody according to somebody else's way of seeing things. So the young Elizabeth, broadly believed to be commissioned by Catherine Parr. So this is about presenting her stepdaughter maybe to her father, whereas the Aging Elizabeth is again a political comment.
Jackie recently saw a video analysing the portrait Unknown Woman in Persian Dress by Marcus Giret. In the video, they claim that it's actually a portrait of Elizabeth I pregnant. Is there any possibility to this, in your opinion?
There's a possibility to anything and everything within reason. I don't believe that Elizabeth has a secret child because I think she's too closely scrutinised and watched. I don't see how that happens.
On to a combined topic which I know has been very important to both of us. How were veterans from wars treated when these wars finished in the past? Did they receive money or lands? Before Napoleon's wars, they were mostly professional. But what happened to them once they came back injured and unable to work? Was PTSD recognised somehow, even if in a different way than we do today? Or is it considered just a weakness?
Absolutely, yes. From the kind of very early warfare, before it was the standard practice for monarchs of this country, for example, to have standing armies, the expectation would be that the barons would be the ones who would show up with men. So these were not career soldiers. They may turn up with labourers and farmhands who have been expected to pick up some military skill. And they are the medieval version of what we now know potentially as cannon fodder. The prized fighters are the armoured soldiers on horseback, whether they're in mail or later in plate armour. But a way to earn wealth, titles and land was to go to war and to revel in the spoils of those wars. If you distinguish yourself beside your monarch in battle, you may find yourself being given a title, given land, given place. We think about the St. Crispin's Day speech from Shakespeare and Henry V, where he talks about how today will gentle their condition. That's about taking somebody who doesn't have a land or a title and making them gentle, essentially raising them up the social order because of the way they distinguish themselves in battle. Mental health in general, and in quotes, insanity, there's been a really long journey towards the frankly limited understanding that we have today. We're still a very, very long way from the full comprehension of how the brain functions, and particularly how the brain, when injured or harmed, functions. And for a long time, mental health issues may have been treated quite cruelly. Not always. There's a odd sort of balance where some people try and starve out the demonic influence or punish the demon within the person, whereas others did recognise the need for compassion and care and gentleness. But in terms of a recognition of what we now know as PTSS, that's been a very recent thing, and its treatment in earlier decades and centuries, even the 20th century, has been woefully lacking and misunderstood.
We've had quite a lot of questions about royalty and the royals. So Courtney asked, and I've asked this question many times, how do you keep track of those intertwined royal family trees?
Every now and again you have to go back and look them up, because there's a lot of cross-pollination and cross-connection, and yes, it's very, very confusing. I think the one, though, that gets more confusing is that at least it's not the Spanish Habsburgs, because that is incredibly confusing.
Karen asked if you have an opinion on why Henry VIII did not marry off his daughters.
I think principally because their position was and became so contested. It would have been far easier if one or the other of them had a surviving brother, because no foreign ruler is going to risk a son on somebody who may or may not be deemed legitimate. It's too big of a risk. I think also the flux that's going on in England's faith and who they're at peace with and who they're at war with is so confused that while Mary is young, he's not going to marry her off because she's such a suitable pawn to offer to France or Spain or whoever else. And of course, by the time Elizabeth is just about to turn 3, her mother is executed and she is named illegitimate. So then he has 2 daughters who are arguably not princesses anymore. They are the Lady Mary and the Lady Elizabeth. Who's he going to marry them to? They're incredibly high profile, but contested as well.
What would have happened if Charles V had demanded that Catherine, maybe Mary too, be sent back to Spain after the annulment? Or why Charles V did not do it?
Well, I think the offer was made, from what I've heard, certainly in the case of Mary, that there was plans to spirit her away. Firstly, I don't think Charles really had the power to demand that of Henry. Had he done so, it would have been effectively acknowledging that Catherine was therefore more Spanish than English, and therefore acknowledged that he wasn't really married to her, that she wasn't his true wife, that he should send her back to from whence she came. I think on top of that, Catherine wouldn't have gone. She thought of herself and believed herself to be Queen of England until her dying day. Dragging them back to Spain would have meant that any claim that Mary might have been able to have to the English throne would have had to be nullified, and Henry wouldn't have allowed it, because on the flip side, if she goes back to Spain, then an army can launch behind her with Charles's fleet. She can come in, depose her father, become queen, and take England back to Rome. Arguably, Charles doesn't get involved because that would have been a political powder keg. Making that demand, and then if you make the demand, you have to act upon it, that's war.
Adina would love to hear your thoughts on why does the UK still have a monarchy?
I think the quick answer to that is because when we tried to be a republic, it didn't work very well. Of course, Oliver Cromwell is a successful protector, but after his death, his son is put in the role, almost acting as a king would act, succeeding from his father. So a republic, it isn't really in the way that we perhaps know it in a modern context. He falls, he's known as Tumble Down Dick, and from that moment onwards, we have our monarchy invited back. The expectation is that we get a growing constitutional monarchy where king and parliament, or queen and government, work in collaboration, and therefore monarch answers to people. And that is what we still have happening now, that our monarchy is a figurehead to our system. It is a constitutional monarchy, and I would say that that is why it works, because they reign, they don't rule.
What are your thoughts on Meghan and Harry?
Well, I've never met them, so I don't know them as people. All I can talk to or speak about is the coverage that I've seen. So I can't really think about them as an historian would look at them, because we simply don't have a far enough remove. What I will say is that, to me at least, it's very evident that the coverage and scrutiny that particularly the Duchess of Sussex has been subjected to has been incredibly unfair. And it's hard for me to see how it isn't, at least in part, racially motivated.
What past events most closely resembled the rather dramatic recent turns that we have seen occur within the present British monarchy? How did they shape or change the monarchy itself?
Well, I think the turn of events that gets talked about in relation to things that have happened in the royal family, I mean, particularly the choice of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex to separate themselves from being full-time working royals. The thing that gets brought up the most is the marriage of Wallis Simpson and Edward VIII and his abdication from the throne of England. I think that's patently unfair. Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, there would have to be a large-scale tragedy for him to ever sit on the throne of England. He isn't abdicating. There have been many, many royals who have chosen to live private lives. And yes, he absolutely was a senior royal, but there has been talk for a number of years about a desire to slim down the monarchy. And I think that what we're seeing now is an evolution of necessity. And there's always been scandal throughout history that has tried to attach itself to members of the royal family. I think that what we're seeing is in some ways unprecedented but not unexpected.
Hilary asked, is there a place in history where succession went wrong, and what have been the modern day implications?
There have been times where thrones have been taken from, in quote, rightful kings or queens. The loss of the Prince in the Tower, the reign of Richard III. If the princes had grown to their majority, if Edward V had grown to be an old man sitting on the throne of England, arguably that would have changed the face of history. We probably wouldn't have had the Tudor dynasty, for example. So I don't necessarily know if we can call that succession going wrong, but I think it is succession being diverted. And of course, that has massive implications for how history plays out.
Who in history asked the best questions?
Well, obviously, you do.
Correct.
But I am, of course, just saying that because you're about to go and cook my dinner. But of course, the real people that ask the best questions in history are all of you. I can't tell you how surprised I was to see how many of you responded to that post I put in the community tab. And I'm so grateful for your insightful questions. I'm just sorry that I probably haven't been able to answer all of them because of time. But what it has shown me is that we need to make another one of these videos at some point. If you agree, if you've enjoyed this video, then please let me know in the comment section, or you can come and find me over on my social media. As always, I'll leave links to my Instagram and Twitter in the description box, so you can follow me there and we can continue all of our amazing conversations. If you enjoyed this video as well, please let me know by hitting the thumbs up. Please also subscribe to this channel, and while you're there, hit the notification bell next to the subscribe button so that YouTube tells you when I've next uploaded. I hope you're going to have a great day, whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.